The rain pounded the pavement like a warning. Each drop a reminder that New York City never slept, never forgave. Julian Carter stood frozen in the alley, his heart hammering louder than the storm, staring into the eyes of Vincent DeRosier, man who owned half the city's underworld and, until tonight, thought he could own him too. 3 hours ago, Julian had been nothing but a bartender dodging bullets in a world he didn't choose. Now, he was the only one who could make the untouchable Mafia king beg. It started with a spilled drink. Julian worked the late shift at the Black Orchid, a dimly lit bar in Hell's Kitchen where the air reeked of whiskey and secrets. The clientele wasn't your average crowd, men in tailored suits with eyes like knives, women whose smiles hid more than they revealed. Julian kept his head down, pouring shots and wiping counters, pretending he didn't notice the deals being made in hushed tones. But Vincent noticed him. From the moment the Mafia boss stepped into the bar 6 months ago, his presence was a gravitational pull, dark, commanding, impossible to ignore. Vincent didn't just walk into a room. He claimed it. 6'3", with a jawline carved from stone and eyes that could burn through steel. He was a myth made flesh. And Julian, with his quiet charm and quick wit, became his obsession. Another bourbon. Kid, Vincent had said that first night, his voice low, like a predator sizing up prey. Julian slid the glass across the counter, meeting those gray eyes for a split second before looking away. He wasn't stupid. He knew who Vincent was, head of the DeRose family, a name whispered in fear from Brooklyn to the Bronx. Men like Vincent didn't just want, they took. And Julian had spent his life dodging men who took too much. But Vincent kept coming back. Night after night, he'd sit at the bar, watching Julian with an intensity that made the air feel too thick to breathe. It wasn't just lust, though, that was there, raw and undeniable. It was something deeper, something that scared Julian more than the gun he knew Vincent carried under his coat. Vincent wanted to possess him, to pull him into a world of blood and power. Julian resisted, keeping his distance, cracking jokes to deflect the tension. But every night, Vincent's gaze chipped away at his walls, and Julian felt himself slipping. Tonight, everything changed. The bar was closing, the last patrons stumbling out into the rain. When Vincent stayed behind, Julian was wiping down the counter, pretending not to notice the man leaning against the bar, his black coat dripping water onto the floor. "You're different," Vincent said, his voice cutting through the silence. "You don't belong in this shithole." Julian laughed, sharp and bitter. "Yeah, tell that to my rent." He turned to face Vincent, expecting the usual smirk. But instead, he saw something raw, something almost human. Vincent stepped closer, too close, and Julian's breath caught as the man's hand grazed his wrist. "You could have more," Vincent murmured. "With me, you'd never want for anything." Julian pulled back, his heart racing. "I'm not a thing to be owned, Mr. DeRose." His voice was steady, but inside, he was shaking. He'd grown up in foster homes, scraping by, learning to survive men who thought they could buy him. Vincent was different, dangerous in a way that made Julian's skin hum, but the game was the same. Vincent's eyes darkened, not with anger, but with something heavier. "You think you're just a bartender," he said. "I see you, Julian. You're fire in a world full of ash. And I'm not letting you burn out here." Before Julian could respond, the door slammed open. 2 men in black suits stormed in, their faces hard, guns barely concealed. "Boss," one of them barked. "Trouble. The Morettas hit our warehouse in Queens. They're sending a message." Vincent's demeanor shifted in an instant, the softness gone, replaced by the cold precision of a man who'd built an empire on fear. "Handle it," he snapped. But his eyes never left Julian. Stay here, he told him, his voice a command wrapped in something softer. This isn't over. Julian didn't stay. He couldn't. The moment Vincent and his men left, he grabbed his jacket and slipped out the back, into the rain-soaked alley. He didn't know why he was running, maybe from Vincent, maybe from the part of himself that wanted to say yes. But as he turned the corner, he heard footsteps behind him. Heavy. Deliberate. He spun around, and there was Vincent. Alone. His coat billowing in the wind. His face a storm of rage and something else, fear. You don't walk away from me, Vincent said, his voice low. Dangerous. But his hands, when they grabbed Julian's shoulders, were gentle. Not tonight. Not ever. Julian's heart pounded. Why me? He demanded, rain streaming down his face. You could have anyone. Why the hell do you care? Vincent's grip tightened, his eyes searching Julian's like he was looking for salvation. Because you're the only thing in this godforsaken world that makes me feel alive. The alley fell silent, save for the rain. Julian's breath hitched. He'd spent his life building walls, but Vincent was tearing them down with every word, every look. And in that moment, Julian realized he wasn't just running from Vincent, was running from himself. The next morning, Julian woke to the sound of his phone buzzing. He was back in his tiny apartment in Brooklyn. The events of last night a blur of rain and reckless choices. He'd let Vincent walk him home. Let him linger at the door. Let him say things that made Julian's chest ache. He hadn't invited him in yet, but the line between resistance and surrender was blurring. The text was from an unknown number. Meet me at the pier. 8 p.m. Don't make me come find you. No signature. But Julian knew. Vincent didn't ask. He demanded. And yet, there was a pull in Julian's gut. A reckless need to see where this led. He spent the day distracted, pouring drinks at the bar with half his mind elsewhere. His coworker, Lena, noticed. You okay, Jules? She asked, her voice sharp with concern. You look like you saw a ghost. Something like that, Julian muttered, dodging her questions. Lena was the closest thing he had to family. A no-nonsense woman who'd seen enough of the city's underbelly to know when trouble was brewing. If she knew about Vincent, she'd tell him to run. But running didn't feel like an option anymore. At 8 p.m., Julian stood at the edge of the Hudson River Pier, the city skyline glittering like a promise. Vincent was already there, leaning against the railing, his silhouette sharp against the water. He turned as Julian approached, and the look in his eyes, half hunger, half reverence, made Julian's knees weak. You came, Vincent said, his voice softer than Julian expected. Didn't feel like I had a choice. Julian shot back, but there was no bite in his words. He stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat radiating from Vincent's body. What do you want from me, Vincent? Really? Vincent's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Julian thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice raw. I want you to see me. Not the name, not the power, just me. Julian's breath caught. He'd spent his life hiding his past, his pain, his heart. But Vincent was asking him to step into the light, to risk everything for a man who lived in shadows. And the scariest part, Julian wanted to. Before he could respond, a black SUV screeched to a stop at the end of the pier. Vincent's hand shot to his gun, his body shielding Julian's in an instant. Stay behind me, he growled, as three men stepped out, their faces hard, their intentions clear. The Morettas had come for blood. The pier erupted into chaos. Vincent moved like a predator, his gun drawn in a blur, barking orders to men Julian hadn't even noticed lurking in the shadows. Gunfire cracked through the air, sharp and deafening, as Julian dropped to the ground. his heart slamming against his ribs. He wasn't built for this foster kid. Bartender. Survivor. Not a soldier in Vincent's war. But as he crouched behind a stack of crates, Vincent's voice cut through the noise. Steady and fierce. Julian. Stay down. The fight was over in minutes. But it felt like hours. Vincent's men were efficient. Brutal. Leaving the Moretti enforcers sprawled on the pavement. Groaning or worse. Vincent stood over one. His gun pressed to the man's temple. His face a mask of cold fury. Tell your boss to back off. He snarled. Or I burn your entire operation to the ground. Julian's stomach twisted. This was Vincent's world violence. Power. Control. And yet, when Vincent turned to him, his expression softened, his hands trembling as he pulled Julian to his feet. You okay? He asked, his voice rough, like he was afraid of the answer. Julian nodded, though his legs felt like jelly. You didn't have to do that, he said, glancing at the bodies. Not for me. Vincent's jaw clenched. I'd do worse for you. The words hung between them, heavy with truth. Julian wanted to argue, to push back, but the intensity in Vincent's eyes silenced him. This wasn't just about possession anymore. It was something bigger, something that scared them both. They didn't speak as Vincent drove him back to Brooklyn, the city blurring past in a haze of neon and rain. Inside Julian's apartment, the air was thick with unspoken words. Vincent stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the flickering streetlights, while Julian paced, trying to make sense of the night. This is crazy, he finally said, his voice breaking. You're a mafia boss. Vincent. I'm nobody. Why are you risking everything for me? Vincent turned, his eyes blazing. You're not nobody. You're the only thing that makes this life worth living. He crossed the room in 2 strides, stopping just short of touching Julian. I've spent years building walls. Julian, you're the first person who's ever gotten through. Julian's breath hitched. He wanted to run, to hide from the weight of those words. But he couldn't move. Vincent's hand lifted, hesitant, brushing a strand of hair from Julian's face. The touch was electric, and Julian felt his resolve crumbling. You're going to get us both killed, he whispered, but he didn't pull away. Then we'll die together, Vincent said, his voice low, fierce. And then he kissed him. It wasn't gentle, it was desperate, hungry, like Vincent was pouring every ounce of himself into it. Julian kissed him back, his hands fisting in Vincent's coat, pulling him closer. For the first time in his life, Julian felt seen not as a kid from nowhere, not as a means to an end, but as someone who mattered. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Vincent was relentless, showing up at the bar, at Julian's apartment, always with that same intensity that made Julian's heart race. They stole moments in dark corners, in parked cars, in the quiet of Julian's tiny living room. Every touch, every whispered word, pulled Julian deeper into Vincent's world. But it wasn't just passion. Vincent opened up in ways Julian hadn't expected, stories of a childhood marked by loss, of a brother he couldn't save, of a life he hadn't chosen but couldn't escape. Julian shared his own scars: foster homes, betrayal, the constant fight to prove he was enough. They were 2 broken pieces, fitting together in a way that felt like fate. But the world outside didn't care about their fragile connection. The Morettis were circling, their attacks growing bolder. Vincent's empire was under siege, and Julian was the weak spot his enemies had sniffed out. One night, Lena pulled Julian aside at the bar, her eyes sharp with worry. You're in deep with him, aren't you? She said. Jules, you gotta get out. Vincent's not just a bad boy's a death sentence. Julian wanted to argue, but the fear in her voice mirrored his own. He'd seen the blood on Vincent's hands. The men who followed his orders without question. He knew the cost of loving someone like Vincent. But when he looked at Vincent, sitting at the bar with that rare, unguarded smile, Julian couldn't walk away. It was a week later when the Morettas struck again. Julian was closing up the bar when the windows shattered, glass exploding inward as gunfire tore through the night. He dove behind the counter, heart pounding, as Vincent's men returned fire from the shadows. When the chaos stopped, Vincent was there, pulling Julian into his arms, his face pale with rage and fear. "They know about you," he said, his voice shaking. "They know you're mine." Julian's blood ran cold. He'd always known Vincent's world was dangerous, but now it was personal. The Morettas weren't just after territory, they were after him, to break Vincent by breaking his heart. And Vincent, the man who'd built an empire on fear, looked at Julian like he was the only thing worth protecting. "We need to move," Vincent said, his voice hard. "You're not safe here anymore." Julian shook his head, defiance flaring. "I'm not running. This is my life." "Vincent." Vincent's eyes softened, but his grip on Julian's arm was firm. "Your life is with me now, and I'll burn this city down before I let them touch you." Vincent's safe house was a fortress disguised as a penthouse, perched high above Manhattan with walls of glass and men stationed at every entrance. Julian felt like a caged bird, surrounded by luxury but trapped by the weight of Vincent's world. The city sparkled below, indifferent to the war brewing in its shadows. Vincent had insisted Julian stay here, away from the bar, away from the life he'd built. "Just until I handle the Morettas," Vincent had said, but his eyes betrayed the lie. This wasn't temporary. This was Vincent trying to keep him. Julian hated the guards, the silence, the feeling of being owned. But every night, when Vincent came back, bruised and bloodied from whatever battles he fought, Julian's resolve wavered. Vincent would collapse onto the couch, his walls down, and Julian would sit beside him, their hands finding each other in the dark. They didn't talk about the future, too dangerous, too uncertain, but in those quiet moments, Julian felt something he'd never known: home. Still, the tension grew. Vincent was unraveling, his empire cracking under the Morettas' relentless attacks. Julian overheard hushed conversations: warehouses burned, men lost, alliances crumbling. Vincent was fighting a war on two fronts, one against his enemies, and one against the fear of losing Julian. It showed in the way he held Julian too tightly, the way his voice broke when he whispered, "I can't lose you." One night, Julian couldn't take it anymore. He found Vincent in the study, poring over maps and documents, his face etched with exhaustion. "This has to stop," Julian said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "You're tearing yourself apart." "Vincent." "For what?" "Me." Vincent looked up, his eyes haunted. "You don't get it, do you? You're the only thing keeping me human." He stood, crossing the room to pull Julian close. "Without you, I'm just the monster they all think I am." Julian's heart ached. He wanted to save Vincent, to pull him out of this life. But he knew it wasn't that simple. Vincent was the DeRose family, and the DeRose family was blood and power. Still, Julian kissed him, fierce and desperate, pouring every ounce of himself into it. "Then let me help you," he whispered. "Let me in." Vincent hesitated, then nodded. For the first time, he let Julian see the truth: names, plans, the inner workings of his empire. It was a risk, one that could get them both killed. But it was also a promise: they were in this together. The next day, Julian met Lena in secret. She'd been texting him, begging him to leave Vincent, to save himself. They met at a diner in Queens. far from Vincent's reach. Lena's eyes were red, her voice sharp. You're not thinking straight, Jules. He's a killer. You think you can change him? I don't want to change him, Julian said, his voice quiet but firm. I want to love him. Lena shook her head, tears falling. Love doesn't survive in his world. You're going to get hurt. Julian wanted to argue, but her words lingered, heavy with truth. He left the diner, his mind a storm of doubt and determination. When he returned to the safe house, Vincent was waiting, his face pale. You want to see her, he said. Not a question. His voice was calm, but his eyes were a hurricane. She's my friend, Julian said, standing his ground. I'm not your prisoner. Vincent. Vincent's hands clenched, but he didn't move. Every second you're out there, they could take you. Do you know what that would do to me? Julian stepped closer, his voice soft but fierce. Then trust me. Trust us. Vincent's walls cracked, and he pulled Julian into his arms, holding him like he was the only thing tethering him to the world. I'm trying, he whispered. God help me. I'm trying. But trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. That night, the safe house was attacked. The windows shattered, gunfire echoing through the penthouse as Vincent's men fought back. Julian crouched behind a marble counter, his heart pounding, as Vincent shielded him, his gun blazing. When the dust settled, the attackers were dead, but one of Vincent's men lay bleeding out on the floor. Julian's hands shook as he pressed a cloth to the man's wound, Vincent's voice barking orders in the background. We can't stay here, Vincent said, his face grim. They're getting too close. Julian looked at him, blood on his hands, fear in his heart. Then we fight back, he said. Together. Vincent's eyes widened, and for a moment, Julian saw something new. Pride. You're braver than I deserve, Vincent said, his voice rough with emotion. He pulled Julian close, kissing him fiercely, as if sealing a vow. We end this. For us. The plan was reckless, but it was theirs. Vincent laid it out in the early hours, his voice low. His men gathered in a warehouse on the edge of the city. The Morettis were planning a final strikeia meeting at their stronghold in the Bronx, where their leader, Marco Moretti, would be vulnerable. Vincent wanted to hit them first, to end the war before it consumed them all. Julian listened, his heart pounding, knowing he was no longer just a bystander. He was part of this, part of Vincent, and there was no turning back. You don't have to come, Vincent told him later, when they were alone. His hands cupped Julian's face, his eyes searching. I can keep you safe. Away from this. Julian shook his head. I'm not hiding anymore. If we're doing this, we're doing it together. Vincent's expression softened, and he kissed Julian, slow and deep, like he was memorizing him. You're my weakness, he murmured, and my strength. The night of the raid was cold, the air thick with tension. Vincent's men moved like shadows, slipping into the Moretti stronghold with lethal precision. Julian stayed close to Vincent, his heart racing but his resolve firm. He wasn't a fighter, but he'd learned enough from Vincent to hold his own. When the first shots rang out, he didn't flinch. He stayed by Vincent's side, watching the man he loved become a force of nature, fierce, unstoppable, but always glancing back to make sure Julian was safe. The battle was brutal, a blur of gunfire and blood. Julian's hands shook as he helped drag one of Vincent's wounded men to safety, his mind screaming that this was wrong, that love shouldn't cost this much. But when he looked at Vincent, fighting not just for power but for them, he knew he'd made his choice. They found Marco Moretti in a back room, his face pale but defiant. Vincent stood over him, gun raised, his voice cold. This ends tonight. Marco laughed. A bitter sound. You think killing me stops this? You're weak. DeRose. That boy's made you soft. Vincent's hand trembled, but his eyes were steel. He's made me human. Before Marco could respond, Vincent pulled the trigger. The shot echoed. Final and absolute. The war was over, but the cost was heavy. Vincent's men were battered. Some lost forever. Julian stood in the wreckage, his hands stained with blood that wasn't his, his heart heavy with the weight of what they'd done. Vincent found him, pulling him into his arms, his face etched with grief and relief. It's over, he whispered. You're safe. Julian pulled back, searching Vincent's eyes. But are we free? Vincent didn't answer right away. He looked out at the city, its lights flickering like stars in a bruised sky. I don't know, he admitted, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you deserve. They left the city that night, driving north to a cabin Vincent owned in the Adirondacks. It was simple, far from the chaos of New York, a place where they could breathe. They sat by a fire, the silence between them soft, healing. Julian leaned against Vincent, feeling the steady beat of his heart. I didn't think I could love someone like you, Julian said, his voice quiet. But I do. Vincent's arms tightened around him. You're the only thing that matters, he said. I'd burn it all down for you. Julian smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek. You don't have to. Just stay. And Vincent did. They built a life in the quiet, away from the blood and the power. It wasn't perfect. Vincent's past lingered, a shadow they could never fully escape. But every morning, when Julian woke to find Vincent beside him, he knew they'd fought for something worth having. Love wasn't just their weakness. It was their rebellion, their defiance against a world that tried to break them. And in the end, it was enough.